Okay, good morning. Welcome everyone. This is the third edition of the laboratory of the University of Naples L'Orientale, titled China and the Middle East from the Cold War to the present. This is like a laboratory that is organized under the framework of the Master in International Relations and Institution of Asia and Africa of the University of Naples Orientale, where I'm currently working. We decided to focus on this topic, which seems pretty timely, and we already had a couple of interesting seminars with Professor Andrea Ghiselli from Fudan University and Professor Nushin Chun from Shen Dayuan from Kikir. Both of them in different ways, quite renowned scholars in their own field. And today, in order to continue and keep the level, high, the standard high of our lectures, I have the honor and the pleasure to have with us my close friend and colleague from Tsinghua University, Professor She Gangzheng, that is going to discuss with us and introduce us to the very interesting topic of the Chinese policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict, and more importantly, during the Cold War, which is based on his PhD research and some publication that actually he introduced. He published, especially one on the Journal of Cold War Studies in 2020. Gangzheng is assistant professor at the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He got his bachelor in Hebrew language and culture from Peck University. I guess it's from the School of Foreign Languages, right?
Yes, that's
okay.
right.
And the PhD in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis, where he actually focused on China-Middle East relations and China's involvement in the Arab-Israel conflict during the Cold War. So this is a very, as I said before, given the recent development and China's brokerage of the agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is of course also connected to the relationship with Israel and Palestine, and we will see how, thanks to the help of Professor She. I mean, the role of China in the Middle East is all of a sudden has become like the news of the day. I mean, very much prominent. So I'm very happy that this seminar is actually enjoy, this attention, thanks to the participation of my students from University Orientale, but also to external auditors and to the distribution that we are the promotion that we are giving through the ChinaMed Project of our talks. Last week, Professor Nushin Chun lecture was recorded and placed on ChinaMed YouTube channel, and then it was distributed by our friend and from Israel, Tuvia Goering, who is running a very interesting and informative newsletter called Discourse Power, mostly based on analysis of Chinese thinkers on different topics, but most importantly on China's policy in the Middle East. Same will be for our seminar today. So we are actually recording it. You can find it and enjoy it or share it looking at the ChinaMed YouTube channel or ChinaMed website, and then Tuvia Goering will also analyze it and spread it through the Discourse Power newsletter. So without too much further ado, and I would like to thank once again Gangzheng for being with us today. I hope the connection is smooth. I'm going to shut up now, and I leave the floor to you and your beautiful presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrico. I'm very grateful to Professor Fardella's invitation to let me have this chance to give a talk and also to have the discussion with all of you who participated in today's event. So I will share my screen. So I hope everything will go as we planned it. Okay, so wait a second. The PowerPoint. Let me. PowerPoint. Okay. Can you guys see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
No problem, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. Thank you very much. So thanks for Professor Fardella's kind words. I'm She Gangzheng, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of International Relations in the School of Social Sciences at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and I'm also now the director of the Center for Overseas Securities at Tsinghua. So today, the topic, the task I was given is to cover the Cold War and also the Chinese policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. But we could also discuss or have some comparisons about the historical trajectory and nowadays developments. But the focus of my talk will be primarily focusing on the historical part, which covers the years or the decades starting from 1949 and to the end of the Cold War. And there are many interesting aspects in the development between China's policies or the strategies in general, or the policy in particular towards the Middle East, in particular towards the Arab-Israel conflict, which is the central themes at the time about the Middle Eastern politics back then. Okay. Okay. So as we mentioned, the Middle East has a very long history that connected to China from the Asian corridors to connect the different civilizations at both ends of the Eurasia. And nowadays, as you can tell, it is also the geographical center of the Belt and Road Initiative. But as we can see, the Belt and Road Initiative doesn't come out of nowhere. It has the history of this kind of evolution or the development. So it doesn't mean that suddenly when China grows stronger and suddenly we'll say that, oh, I want to have this kind of initiative and out of the blank sheet. Actually, China has trying to cultivate the relations and also trying to learn how to deal with the very important part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the Middle East after 1949, after the founding of the People's Republic. Okay, so to make this kind of this is the table that I make. This is also the table that I made based on my observation from the founding of the People's Republic to now. And I roughly developed it into different phases. Okay, and then between the major phases, we have some transitional phases. Okay, and we can see that there is a very interesting aspects when we look at the Chinese policy or Chinese relations or its approaches towards the Middle East. I think there were different time periods. There will be different time focuses on the domestic level and also on its foreign policy level. And the most important thing that we will talk about as one also the central theme is that the criteria for separating friends from enemies in the process that China tries to learn how to deal with the many different peoples, countries, and states in the Middle East. And I borrow these ideas is that I think this is also the very interesting transition that if we take a look at Mao's work, Chairman Mao Zedong's work, I think in one of the most famous, also in the one of the first articles in the collection of Mao's article, we can see the sentences that who is our enemy and who is our friend. This is the most fundamental question for revolution. Although we cannot say that the Chairman Mao's teaching is still the most important thing for to guide China's diplomacy nowadays, but I think to understand the criteria that separating friends and the foes, I think this is a very important way to understand the central themes or the key concepts about China's Middle East policy and also the foreign policy in general as well. Okay, so I will briefly talk about the development and the interesting aspects in different time periods, in different phases, and then we will also talk about some kind of like the interesting cases in different phases. As you can tell, I don't know whether you have the chance to look at my article that published in 2020 by the Journal of Cold War Studies. Conflict, but it actually covers only a relatively short period of time. It was like starting from 1963 and end roughly 1975. So it was actually this part. So it was narrowly defined as the Cold War and the Chinese policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. But as we can tell, starting from 49 and until the end of the Cold War, this is like broadly defined. This is the Cold War and the different emphasis both at home and abroad also in fact impact the Chinese policy all the way and also until today. So this is something that I would like to share my observations, my understandings with you.
Sorry, Gangzheng, there is Leonardo. You raise your hand.
Yeah. Also, a quick question. I think the slides are not changing for us. I think the professor is going ahead, but the slides for us have remained the same so far.
Yeah, same for me. But I thought that have you already changed the slide?
I already changed the slide.
Okay, so it's stuck for me as well. Now it's fine. Can you? Okay, so the previous one.
Can you now see the table?
Yeah, we see the table. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Can you see Leonardo?
Yes, I can see this table.
Okay, great.
Oh, okay. So maybe the audience may miss one slide before that. Can you see that I changed the slide? No.
Now we can't see it. It's still the table.
Yeah, it's still the table.
Okay. Let me figure out whether I could change the way that I share the screen. Okay. 1 second. I will share the screen.
Yeah. In the meantime, guys, in the chat, I share Professor She's article on Journal of Cold War, the one he referred to.
Okay. Now, now you guys can see the slides, right?
Yes. Now much better.
This is now you can see I changed the slide.
Okay. Yes.
The second slide.
Yes.
Okay. So this is the slide that I showed that from the current perspective, the geographical center, the Middle East is the geographical center for the Belt and Road Initiative. It plays a very important role for the two most lucrative and important destinations of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the Europe and the other is the Africa. And Middle East play a very important part in this grand strategy of China's geo-economic and even also geopolitical initiative. But as I emphasize, this is the importance of the Middle East didn't come out of nowhere. So this is how we're going to go through the historical developments. Okay, so can you guys like follow? Now is the slides for the table, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, great. So thank you very much for I don't know which one raised this issue, but thank you very much. Otherwise,
Leonardo Bruni is a ChinaMed researcher.
Okay.
Peg University student now.
Okay. Great. Okay, so this is the table that I make based on my personal observation and understanding. I will go through them one by one, and we can have some points raised in the process. Okay, so the first is I think the first phase is starts from 1949 and roughly to 1955 or 56. I call it this the first phase. I think this, on the domestic level, the most important thing for the CCP, which is the Chinese Communist Party, is to consolidate the control of the whole mainland, okay, the region consolidation, and also the foreign strategy and the international background. We all know that it starts from the Korean War, and also after the Korean War, in the face of the containment that posed by the United States, the response from the Chinese side or from Beijing is that the idea that is raised by Professor Liu Jun from Peking University, which is retired for now, but he raised a very important idea is to re-establish the intermediate zones. Idea that was like for a short period of time that Mao raised after the Second World War, but it was like put on the shelves for a while. But in this like mid 1950s, it was like put on the table again. It was like to re-establish the intermediate zones. Okay, and for this period, I think the most important way that China trying to understand the Middle East is a very interesting line. It was because just after the CCP gained control or take over the mainland, it has not so many, although it has some preliminary experience to deal with some great powers, but it lacks like the enough knowledge or enough the subtle ideas of how of the Middle East. Okay, so compared to not only to the French, the British, also the Americans and the Russians, I think China is the one that lacks enough knowledge about these areas. But however, as a emerging power, it has this kind of like different information or requests from different aspects, trying to establish the relations with the new regime or trying to observe this kind of like new regime. So for this kind of the new PRC, I think the most important thing is that you need to set a criteria in this very seemingly very complicated, very complex region, that how to differentiate who might be your friends and who might be your foes. So as we can see later, that to China's understanding, it will have this kind of like the focus on trying to evaluate this kind of like the social structure and to see who is more progressive in its own eyes, in China's own eyes, in Beijing's own eyes. Okay, so for several years after 49, Israel was definitely the most progressive in the social terms, right? It has a central left governing coalition, right? And they also have this kind of like many left-leaning social apparatus and structures. And in contrast, those kind of like Arab states is more like basically monarchies, and also have this kind of like a very anti-Soviet or anti-communist orientations. So this is some kind of like a very important line that China try to learn from the scratch, that who could be its partner in this region. And also we all know that after with the deterioration of the Israeli Soviet-Israeli relations, and also with the revolution, the July Revolution in Egypt, I think China become trying to perceive also in this line of thinking, that but draw the conclusion that Israel was like although it's still governing from this kind of like Mapai coalition, but it was moving like more and more towards the west, while the Egyptians, they start to have this kind of like anti-imperialist, anti-feudalism, land reforms and nationalization, all kinds of things. So in comparison, the Egyptians becomes more progressive than the Israelis, and China shift its focus, especially with the help of the Bandung Conference, and then to make friends with the Egyptians and also Nasser, and it's kind of like the ideas of the Pan-Arab nationalism. Okay, so this is, I think this is the first of the phase one that has a very clear line that China tries to learn from scratch, and then use this kind of like understanding that to identify in a very preliminary way that who might be the friends in the region. Okay. And then there will be the transitional period. And then in this transitional period, we all know that it's from late 1950s to early 1960s. So basically speaking, on a domestic level, we have this great leap forward, and also this kind of like reflections and rescues for this kind of the outcome of this social movements. And also in this kind of like on the international level, I think China starts to have these ideas that with the death of the Stalin, we might be able to achieve some role in leading the world revolution. Although at this moment, it was like more or less to work together with the USSR to guide the world towards the revolutionary way. It was not entirely against the USSR, and then, but we can see a lot of kind of like undercurrents began to surge. But this is the general ideas that China starts to shift its focus to have more ambitious progress or ambitious ideas. Okay, and then in the major phases too, I think this is from the 1960s, the early 1960s. Actually, to be specific, it is from the 1963, and then approximately end in 1971. It was like when China was recognized as the legitimate. The PRC was recognized as the legitimate members in the UN. I think, and also China and United States began its rapprochement. I think this is the period we call it as the before the Cultural Revolution and the early stage of the Cultural Revolution. And then the most important, and together with this very radical domestic agenda, we can see a very assertive, very radical ideas to struggle for the leadership of the world revolution. And this time it was against the USSR. And so the main idea is that, as you may know, the idea is to fight people with two fists. Okay, if it's not just to find the U.S. imperialism, but also find the Soviet revisionism or revisionist socialism. So the ideas, the criteria to pick friends in the region of the Middle East, which is our target region, that is who is willing to be anti-US and anti-Soviet at the same time. So this is kind of like the very wild design for the order, for the regional and the international order. And as we can tell, most country or most actors in the international arena back then don't have such an interest to be anti-US and anti-Soviet at the same time. So it was in fact, it was a very difficult time for China to find the genuine or the powerful allies or friends or partners in the world and also in the Middle East. However, there has been some in such background. There's some very interesting developments, and as I put it in my article, is that the PLO or the Fatah and later become the central pillar of the PLO. These Palestinians, they are against Israel for sure, and they try to gain support from the Eastern Bloc, and in particular, they tried the Soviets first. However, the Soviets have this kind of a more or less neglect their request and perceive them as more or less kind of like will have this very futile endeavors. So, to China's understanding, although you are not straightforwardly anti-US and anti-Soviets, but you are in a position that you have been neglected or overlooked by two superpowers, and I perceive you with great potentials. So China kind of like pour invest like huge resources into the PLO. And I think this is, I would say that this could be seen as a huge success, because later on, especially after the Six-Day War, when the Arab states lose this kind of like the legitimacy to continue to speak for the Palestinians, and the PLO became the speaker of the Palestinian national struggles. I think at the time that it was like everyone will pay attention to this group, and this group will also make no secret that its connection with Beijing. So I think this is a very special investment, and then it paid off in some way. Although with regards to the state-to-state relations, I would say this is the period of the low tide, or the ebb of the Chinese relations with Middle Eastern countries, because China's main focus is about this kind of like non-governmental groups, and try to present itself as the genuine leader of the world revolution, and then portray the Soviets as the fake, ingenuine partner of all this kind of like national liberation movements or the revolutionary groups. Okay, so this is, I think, this is the most important themes in this period of time. Okay, and so afterwards, like with the China's re-entry, the PRC's re-entry, or China's re-entry into the UN, and it has kind of like shifted focus on from the battleground, from the previous focus on the ground, about how to actually carry out the guerrilla fight, how to fight the Israelis on the ground, to the the headquarters of the UN. Okay, so it's more or less trying to use this kind of like very special connections to promote China's standing in the international arena, especially in the very early days after the re-entry of the UN. Okay, and also with the focus on the domestic level, we can see there has been the decline of this the so-called revolutionary zeal or the radical ideas in the early years of the Cultural Revolution. It was now the mid or the late Cultural Revolution. So it was like more, and Mao has this kind of like more subtle ideas about the world. Okay, it was like to present it in a more subtle way, and this is the what we see as the three words ideas. As the this is more or less different from the three words classification in the classic Western textbooks. Is not the U.S. And its allies, Soviet and its allies, and all the non-alignment countries. But in Mao's ideas, the three words became the first word will be the two superpowers, and the second words will be all the developed countries in the world, and then the third word will be all the developing countries. So this is kind of like China's ideas to portray its positions in the world, not in those kind of like in the previous phases, the main phases too, that trying to like to say that to encircle the cities from the countryside and destroy everything more or less like this. But it was like we are definitely in the third world, and we can work with the second world in against the hegemony of the first world, and in particular against the Soviets. Okay, so this is mainly the transition. We can see the subtle transitions in this slide. And okay, and so now it comes to the second half of the 1970s, and with Mao's death, now there was a power struggle within the CCP, and then Hua Guofeng and also Deng Xiaoping, although they have different kind of like visions for China's future, but I think very important for this time period, for the early stage of the reform and reopening up, I think the very important similarities between Hua Guofeng and Deng Xiaoping is that they largely inherit Mao's ideas of like anti-Soviet strategy, the focus of anti-Moscow. I think this is a very important similarities, although they have very different designs for the domestic structures. But in the international arena, I think both of them have this same ideas in mind. So this is what they focus back then as a horizontal line and a big terrain. Or in Chinese, we call it as 一条线一大片, which all focus on contain or fight against the expansion, the so-called expansion of the Soviet hegemony. Okay, so now the focus is very clear that it's not about to fight the U.S. and the U.S. and the USSR at the same time, but the most important is that who is more willing to be anti-Soviets. Okay, so if you are going to be anti-Soviets, that no matter how many differences we might have, we could be friends in one way or another. And this is also true in the Middle East, as we can see at that time where the Carter administration, the U.S. Carter administration, trying to push forward this kind of like the Middle East peace process. and all these kind of like possible partners in this process that could work with the United States at the time have a deep suspicions or the mistrust, or this kind of like adverse feelings against the Soviets. So all these kind of like partners have been in one way or another have the potential to be China's friends in the region. So we can see that Egypt under Anwar Sadat has a very bad relations with Moscow at the time. So China will have all the reasons to continue to support Sadat's the effort to decoupling from the Soviets, and also trying to provide. Actually, before the U.S. Congress was able to grant the sending the U.S. armaments towards the Egyptians, because at the time the Egyptians hadn't signed a peace treaty with Israel, so the U.S. Congress has many suspicions about sending arms to the Egyptians, and also at the time the Soviets already cut off its armament supplies to Cairo. So in this gap, in this period, China sent like a lot of weaponries, first like for free, and later for trade to the Egyptians. And also at the same time, we can see that the Israelis, okay, although China in the newspapers criticized Israel all the time back then, but China established secret contacts with Israelis in this time period. We can talk about with some very concrete examples later on, and this is, but because Israel has a very has this kind of like anti-Soviet tendencies or stance, especially with the Begin Menachem Begin's government that came to power. They have a very deep suspicions against the Soviet Union. So I think China and Israel have find a common ground in this regard. And also China also trying to make friends with the Saudis. Saudi Arabia at this moment, not as successful as its relations with the Egyptians and Israelis, but also make some kind of like a progress and lay the foundation for future endeavors to establish diplomatic relations. And the reasons for that is that at that moment, the Saudis has a very strong feelings that have this kind of like empathy with the ROC, with the Republic of China, which is in Taiwan, and you feel like Riyadh and Taipei are on the same boat to be the U.S. allies that Washington may consider abandoning in the sacrifice for the détente or for the rapprochement with communist regime. Either it will be Soviets or the communist Chinese. Okay, so this is another story. But in short, that China made some progress in the region and established a very firm relations with those most anti-Soviet countries or states on the ground. Okay. Okay, and then it was almost at the end of the Cold War, so we witnessed another transitional period, and this is almost like the time when Gorbachev came to power, and also in China we can see that there has been some ideas. They're trying to, I think it was more or less influenced by the radical change or radical reforms of Gorbachev. It also tries to carry out some reforms, both in political and economic terms. And as we can tell for now, it faced serious setbacks, okay, especially with the 1989 all this kind of like the issues back then. And then in China's domestic on the domestic level, there has been many reflections and many debates. So whether we should continue the reform opening up, or whether we should just go back to the old days, or if we want to continue the reform and opening up, which way should we take? Which focus, which emphasis should we focus on? Okay, so for this period, it was a relatively chaotic moment on the domestic level, and on the international backgrounds or the China's foreign strategies, I think the most important thing is the normalization. And this normalization is not just about the normalization of the relations between China and the Soviet Union. It's also, to me, I think it is the normalization of the relations between China and the United States. I think this has two kind of like connotations. Okay, so the first one is that I think in the previous period, China has overly rely on the U.S. to contain or to deter the Soviet Union, and then the leadership in Beijing realized this is could be a big problem for China. And because if you align with the US too closely, it will have this very sharp contrast to your self-identification as part of the third world or the developing world, and so it will have a very severe crisis in your identification and your portrait of who you really are. Okay, and also it will create some problems either at home and abroad. And also, I think this is kind of like the moment that we can see this kind of like that both that China kind of like to say that we don't want to play the U.S. card or against the Soviets, or we don't want to play the Soviet cards against the U.S. And we don't want to be played as the China card against anybody. So it was like a back to a little bit similar to the Mao's period, but has a much more practical style or techniques enduring with like most countries in the world. Okay, so this is, I think, normalization has a broader meaning, not just about the normalization of Sino-Soviet relations. Okay. Okay, and I will also briefly talk about the post-Cold War era. So I think as we can see, that starting from 1992 with the so-called Southern Tour, Nanxun Jianhua, and the speeches during the tour to the south by Deng Xiaoping, we can see China restart its reform and opening up process. And it was like generally it's a continuation during Jiang Zemin's period and Hu Jintao's period. And in the world, generally speaking, we can see this as a unipolar moment. Okay, it was like the China don't want to have don't want to play a too conspicuous or obvious role in either endorsing the U.S.-led global order or challenging this global order. And as we can see, that most countries at the time recognize either implicitly or implicitly or explicitly recognize this is the unipolar moment, more or less, for the United States. So China's focus with the restart of the reform and opening up has like more or less solely on the business types with other countries, and regarding the Middle East, we can see the same type, that no matter who you want to be the business partner of China, we can do business. Okay, so this is something that we can see for almost like more than 2 decades. Okay, so this is a very important features, and I think this is also the reason, the major reason, one of the major reason that some criticize that China was taking a free ride, because they're also focusing on the business and don't have any interest either in challenging or endorsing the U.S. efforts on the political terms regarding the restructuring of the regional order. But I think this is a very important thinking, is that China wants to focusing on the development of economic ties, and this is the important criteria back then. Okay, so as we can see from these historical developments, so as we can see from the in the phase what I'm talking about is the main phases. Okay, for the phases 1 and 3, when who is more progressive or who is more willing to be anti-Soviet, China could find some friends in the Middle East. Because if you find someone progressive, that means others will be less progressive or even have this kind of like reactionary, right? And also when you find someone is willing to be anti-Soviet, that you will find some others will be pro-Soviet. So you will find some friends and you will find some enemies or some strangers. If you don't want to make the enemies too obvious, you will find strangers. Okay, but I think in phase 2, there's very obvious that you can hardly find any friends according to this criteria, because nobody, generally speaking, nobody is genuine have this kind of like interest to be anti-Soviet and anti-US at the same time. So China will, I will argue that basically in this period, the phase 2, China will have literally few friends in the region, and in comparison to the phase 4, which is more or less like everybody wants to do business in one way or another. So China will find no enemies in the region. Everybody could be the friends. Okay, so and especially under the US-led structure, the security structure, security architecture, or whatever you umbrella, or whatever you want to call, China will only focusing on doing business, and no matter you are, whether your political systems or your international orientations, in one way or another, you want to do business. So in this way, that you could be the friends of China. Okay, so this is, I think there's been a very sharp contrast between the phase 2 and phase 4. Okay, and starting from 2018 to now, it is still not so clear whether we are having this kind of like another transitional period, or we are marching towards a new normal, which is another main phases. Okay, because on the domestic level, I think with the consolidation of the Xi Jinping as the party leader, the China was definitely moving into, as we call it, the new era. Okay, and then on the international level, there were almost hardly anybody to talk about the unipolar movement anymore, because people will come to realize that the US no longer have the absolute powers in dictating many affairs in the world. So I would call it that China now is having this strategic competition with the United States, but it is asymmetric competition, in contrast to the symmetric competition back in the Cold War, when the Soviets and the Americans having this kind of like symmetric competitions back then. Okay, so this is kind of like the most important backgrounds for China's Middle East, endeavors in the Middle East. Although for me, I'm now thinking that maybe the new criteria for separating friends from the enemies is to who would have this kind of like. Excuse me?
No, please go ahead. There was a guest that had mic on.
Oh, okay. So, So this is something that I think the criteria for now maybe is to who is going to uphold or to try to stabilize the regional situation, because this is not just about doing business, but to stabilize the regional situation has also have this kind of like political meanings or connotations. So China, I think, in comparison to other extra-regional great powers, I think China will receive the most damage if any major conflicts broke out in the region. So for China, the most important thing is to try to do its best to stabilize the intra regional relations, and whoever could contribute to this effort could be Beijing's friend, and whoever wants to destabilize this region, China will have much more cautions against such players. Okay, so this is something that I have in mind for the recent developments. Okay, so let's use some a very brief time to talk about the concrete case that in the framework that I just mentioned. So, for example, when the new China, the PRC, was founded, that has been very interesting. As I mentioned, the China has this contacts with the Israelis first, not those Arabs. But as we can tell, there will be many misjudgments from both sides. And very interesting thing is that it will also the development of the bilateral relations, or even the establishment of diplomatic relations, will also delayed by the technical reasons. Okay, this is something that we might ignore nowadays. We will assume that everything, if you have the attention, you will naturally convey your ideas to the other side by one way or another. But at that time, back then in the 1950s, in the late 1940s and 50s, there has been some technical reasons that delayed, at least for several months, of the establishment of China-Israel relations. And then the Korean War broke out. So Israel failed to be the first country in the Middle East to have diplomatic relations with China, and in fact became decades later became the last one to establish diplomatic relations with China, and partly due to this kind of like technical reasons. I elaborate in another articles, but we should also admit that even if China and Israel successfully establish diplomatic relations, it is highly questionable that whether it will sustain all this kind of like ups and downs throughout the Cold War. But at least I think in the 1950s and in the 1950 and in 1954, I think there has been two chances that China might establish a full diplomatic relations with Israel, but due to both the technical reasons and the strategic considerations, observations about from the Chinese side was that like China was the Israelis was moving towards the West gradually, and all this kind of like and the Israelis was worrying about the expansion of communist influence within Israel, with Maki, the Israeli Communist Party, that the government, the Israeli government, worried that if it establish diplomatic relations with China, it might strengthen the influence of the Israeli Communist Party at home. So all this kind of like suspicions delayed the process, and then kind of like forestalled the establishment of relations between China and Israel. Okay, and then we have this kind of like a very game-changing moment, which was the Bandung Conference. And then in this conference, China Premier Zhou Enlai met Nasser for the first time, and before the conference, but also have a very long talk with Nasser during the conference, and then and China gradually realized, and the Nasser and his pan-Arabism or Nasserism might be a more appropriate platform to carry out its activities across the Middle East and also Africa. Okay, so this is the moment that China fundamentally shift its stance, like from the previously more or less pro-Israel in the Arab-Israel conflict to very definitely pro-Arabs in these conflicts. Okay, so this is the very important change. And then also, when China deals with the Arabs, it's not only about the Arab-Israeli conflicts, this only issue, because China and the Arabs will also have many other issues need to deal with. So, for example, China in its like Great Leap Forward period, which is the as I mentioned, in the first transitional period, China made contacts with the Syrian Communist Party leaders, and then which infuriated, these moves infuriated Nasser, and the Chinese relations with Egypt and some other Arab states was in a low time. And also in starting from 1963, China trying to start again its efforts to have this kind of like a charm offensive across the Middle East, and in the framework or in the context of struggle against the Soviet Union for the leadership of the World Revolution or for the Third War. Okay, and the case that presented in a much more details in my article is the case of the PLO, and you can have more information from that from the article. So I think the PLO is a very important case for the Sino-Soviet competition. I think this is the event or the development that has mutual influence. So on the as I argue in the article, that I think that one of the reasons that the Palestinian national liberation movements could become such a focus of international politics throughout the Cold War is due to the Sino-Soviet competition. It's not just about the Cold War between the Soviets and the United States. It is mainly due to the struggle for the leadership of the Third World or the World Revolution between Beijing and Moscow, and their competition like gave a very strong impetus, because both sides will try their best, especially in late 1960s and early 1970s, to promote or to portray itself as the genuine friends of the PLO or the Palestinians. And that makes the Palestinian case or the course a very visible topic in international politics, and every third world countries or every developing countries, in order to identify or to prove themselves as the as part of the developing world or the third world, they need to have a very absolute stance on this case, in supporting the Palestinians against the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian land. So I think this is a very important or often neglected aspect of the story. So the Sino-Soviet competition makes the Palestinian cause a topic of maybe we could call it a political correctness for the third world. Okay, if you fail this test, you can hardly identify yourself as part of the third world. So you must have a very clear stance on this issue, and this kind of like promote visibility of PLO Arafat and his course in this kind of like a process. Okay. And also, as I mentioned in the later part of the Cold War, we have this kind of like China's most important criteria for the Middle Eastern strategy is who will be anti-Soviets. So as I mentioned before, so Israel has a very strong anti-Soviet tendencies. So with the help of this businessman, Shaw Eisenberg, he had a large business network across East Asia, and with his help, like a group of top officials in both the foreign ministry, defense ministry, and other security sectors or the military industry complex in Israel, they all brought Shaw Eisenberg's private plane and secretly fly to China in 1979 and establish this kind of like a secret channel between China and Israel from then. Okay, and then after the Cold War, with the end of the Cold War, and China and Israel like have this kind of like reconnection and openly establish the diplomatic relations, and then the relations will go relatively smooth, in particular in the unipolar moment, okay, because the two sides don't need to worry too much about the shift of international order, okay, because you have the US as the paramount actor in international sphere, and so there will not be so serious problems for the two sides to develop relations. And so we have Rabin visit China, have a very warm receptions, and many college students listened to his speech and was like moved. I saw the I read those kind of like reactions by the Chinese students back then. They were moved by the Rabin speech and was really saddened by his death, his assassination. Okay, and then President Jiang Zemin also visited Israel, the only Chinese president visited Israel in history. But like the Israeli prime ministers, Omar, Netanyahu, and all of them had a relatively frequent visit to China, and both sides have had a quite productive engagements, especially in this kind of like innovations. And in contrast to the Cold War era, that two sides start from this kind of military cooperations, but with the growing concerns about the Chinese military buildup, the Israelis cannot overlook the warning from Washington to continue military cooperation with China. So the focus was now entirely on the civilian sectors. Okay, but we can see the development from the Cold War to now. Okay, and okay, so this is basically the presentation that I want to share with you. To talk about this kind of like developments before throughout the Cold War, and how it laid the foundations for China's foreign policies towards the Middle East to now. Okay, so Professor Fardella.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gangzheng.
Okay.
Yeah, lots of food for thought. I see that upon my request, you added the last slide. Maybe you want to put it back 1 second, because I would like to begin actually, as you know, with that. Before we actually enter into a more technical discussion on a few points, then of course I would like to invite the students and the auditors to raise questions if they have any. Questions can be related, of course, to the Cold War, but rest assured that we are going to touch upon the most recent development of this very important issue. The first thing I would like to ask you is, you mentioned that you are directing this Center for Overseas Security at Tsinghua University. Can you share, like, with our students, like a website, if you have one, even in Chinese, just in terms of like self-promotion?
To be honest, for now, we haven't have this kind of like a very concrete website for the center, because we are still like starting from scratch to build everything together, and I'm kind of like busy. I think by the end of the year we will have.
What is the can you describe, like, briefly, what's the center is going to touch upon? I mean, the core areas of the center.
Okay, so I think the center is mainly focusing on this kind of like what we call the national interest of China, how to preserve or try to promote the national interest in overseas of China. So it will be a relatively broad scopes. It will also regarding this kind of like the security of both the companies and also the individuals in foreign lands. And also this is kind of like some very concrete things. And also my colleague and I have been working for some years. But also for now, I think with this kind of like the development as China's involvement in the world stage and in several areas, the center will also focusing on this kind of like high politics, about this kind of like the general strategy of China's the development of the China's foreign strategy in the new era, and how it will influence the political development in different regions. And per my expertise, so the first focus will be on the Middle East regions, and as you can tell, like with this kind of like a newly negotiated agreements, that we are going to also do some research, and also look forward to cooperating with the other Chinese and other foreign institutes to have this kind of like academic exchange in this regard.
Yes, that's exactly the reason why actually I mentioned about your center, because it's just the beginning of a long cooperation, as you know. So in terms of let's touch upon sources. So in one of the questions that was raised by the students from our students from Orientale, we have some attendants that speak Arabic, and of course, I mean, they are less aware of the Chinese side. But so if you could also share some information about sources from the Middle East, or in this case, I guess, from the Israeli side, Chinese and non-Chinese sources, it would be great.
Okay. So I know your university is I think it's the first university in the European continent to have this kind of like Oriental studies, right? So I think this is a very prestigious institute to conduct this kind of like a transnational national research. So I feel in fact I feel very humbled to share my knowledge or my experience in this regard. So my paper, especially my dissertations back to the doctoral years, is trying to build my thesis on the different sources. So I think the most frequent cited sources for all the researchers around the world, there will be like FRU's U.S. National Security Archives, the Wilson Center, archives database, all these things. So I won't talk too much about it. And so for the research about the between the extra regional powers and the regional powers in the Middle East, so I think to be honest, for the country other than Israel, they don't have a very open or very mature system for the classification of archives. So I think Israel has the most mature kind of like network for declassifying the documents. So I paid visit to the state archives of Israel many times, and now it has. Sorry.
Which up until when are they available? I mean, Israel. I mean, you have the 30 years rule, or?
Sorry.
I mean, the Israeli archive, they have documents available for the Cold War up to which year?
Okay.
You know?
So I think they, generally speaking, they have this kind of like a 20 or 30 years limit. So so generally speaking, a document, if there's no accident or other cases, it should be declassified after 30 or 20 years. So that means that theoretically speaking, they're all across the Cold War, you can have these materials. However, everything has a but. Okay, but many documents will exist by due to the national security reasons. So the opening for more recent archives is a problem. To be honest, is a problem. So basically, for example, for 1950s, 60s, you can almost see everything, no matter the low politics or high politics. But in like a more recent, you could only see something like a cultural exchange or something like that. So this is the thing, at least to my understanding. And also I would like to remind those students who are interested in this part that the State Archives of Israel is carrying out this digitalization for several years, and so you could actually to go to the website and order the scans, the copy of many documents. And to my experience, it's not as sometimes has both pros and cons. Okay, so sometimes so previously you need to go to the location, the actual physical location of the state archives buildings to do the searching, but now you can sit in Italy or in any countries to ask for the scanned copies. But the problem is that sometimes some requests will be denied, and so this will be a problem. But the benefits for this is that you can have this kind, you can save a lot of time and have the sources from many different folders, because usually previously you can like search folder by folder, but now you can search the keywords and find many different sources from different folders from different categories. So I would suggest you to try the website first, and to ask for to use your mail address to ask for the scanned copy of some relevant materials to see whether you can get as many as you want. Okay. And also there has been many other archives in Israel, many archives. For example, the Ben Gurion, like more or less like personal archives in Sadeh Bokeh in Negev. I have been there also many times. and also there have been like the archives for Histadrut, and also for Mapai, and also for many other institutions, and also for many associations. I think there has been an association about those the Jews that has been living in China, and then they returned to Israel, and then they also established their own like library or something like that. So I think there will be many interesting findings if you can land in the country and search for different archives. Okay, so this is for my experience in Israel, and also for the Chinese side, the Chinese Foreign Ministry archives. So this is something that is more or less famous previously, but then it has been been closed for several years. But the recent news, I haven't been there after the pandemic, but the recent news is that it is now reopening. But I haven't tested like how many. What's the scope of your search and the materials you can get. But this is one way that you can get the materials, and some sources has been duplicated by the Wilson Center, so you can also find it in other places. Okay, and also I think if you are going to do this kind of like research about China's interaction with other parts of the world, and also about the domestic policies, I think Nianpu, the official chronicles, is a very interesting things, because sometimes the Nianpu will have many interesting stories within the lines. Okay, so you can compare. You should compare with different kind of like the Nianpus. For example, the Nianpu of Mao, and the Nianpu of Zhou Enlai, and the Nianpu of, for example, Deng Xiaoping or Chen Yun, or all these kind of like important leaders. And you incorporate it with the memoirs of maybe the secondary officials, and you can sometimes you can find a very interesting the subtle concept or the knowledge in their interactions. Okay, so I would suggest you if for those students interested in this topic or in relevant topics, maybe you could also try to look at the Nianpu, the official chronicles of the top leaders and the top diplomats. Okay, so this is another thing. And also the memoirs. I think more and more Chinese diplomats, and also a few governmental officials, Chinese governmental officials, have been publishing their memoirs. Okay, so in the part, although those sensitive items, how many will be left is a little bit questionable, but I would say that you could still find many interesting things in their memoirs. For example, in the memoirs of the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Han Xu, they will find many interesting interactions between the two governments on a lot of like, issues. And also, even in, for example, the memoirs of the PLA marshals, you could find some hint about the military cooperation between China and the foreign industries. Okay, so this is some very interesting findings sometimes. Okay, and also in my research, I also interviewed quite a lot of people. The Arabs, the Israelis, and the Chinese. Some are directly involved in, for example, the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Israel, and on both sides. Okay, and they have the first-hand stories. They may not even put in their memoirs, but they will tell you that there has been some connections between these two peoples or between these two institutions, that you will solve a lot of questions in your endeavor to find the answers. Okay, and not to mention there will be a lot of secondary sources that you also need to look at. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. In terms of Arab archives,
to be honest, I don't know. Maybe it is due to my limitations, but I also consult many some scholars, not many scholars, some scholars on the Arab side, but the Arab archives is not that available. I try to, for example, I try to ask my friends in Cairo to see whether they can find anything in the Egyptian archives, but they told me that I think in recent years it was largely closed. So it is a little bit more or less difficult to get in the official archives. However, I think there has been some memoirs, many memoirs by the Arab leaders and diplomats. And also, like with all these kind of like memoirs, no matter they are from the U.S. side, the Chinese side, the Israeli and Arab sides, there will be some exaggerations of their own roles. So you need to compare all these kind of like resources. But I think the Arabs, like the Chinese and the Israelis, many people also publish many interesting memoirs that you could take as the starting point of doing research.
and in your because if I'm not wrong, but correct me if I'm wrong, in your article on Journal of Cold War, you did not use Wajibu, the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs archival sources, did you?
In that article, there are not so many Chinese Foreign Ministry archives, but in other chapters of my doctoral dissertation, especially before 1963, there has been, actually it was before 1965. It was like before the Cultural.
Yes.
There was a huge amount of like materials that.
So you managed to have access to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archive before they shut down.
Yeah, before, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so now maybe Giovanni, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, excuse me. First of all, I wanted to thank Mr. Sheh for the presentation. And actually, I had a curiosity. So I wanted to know if China developed any ties with Turkey during the third or the fourth period. Because in the third period, China was trying to find anti-Soviet countries in the Middle East, and Turkey was pretty anti-Soviet, so maybe be a tie.
Sorry, Giovanni, the audio is quite unstable. So I think you're asking questions about the role of Turkey, whether China established relationship. I guess we're talking about 1971, right, Gangzheng?
Yes. Excuse me. I'm in the university right now, so there might be a little bit of background noise.
That's why I'm here.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that thank you for the questions. I think this is largely in line with this kind of like a framework that China established diplomatic relations with both Iran and Turkey during this time period of like to start to have this kind of like a big terrain and horizontal line, 一条线一大片. Ideas to have this kind of like the containment of the Soviet expansions. So I think back then, I think China's relations with both Iran and Turkey should be seen as has some relatively good developments. Although in this kind of like a period of time, I think the China's focus is not that much on Turkey itself. Okay, so I think also in this period of time there has been some upheavals, up and downs in the on the domestic level of Turkey, and also I think China don't have too much focuses on the Turkey. And also maybe it is due to my own limitations that are primarily focusing on China's relations between the Arabs and the Israelis. Okay, but I can say that with certainty that China's relations with both Turkey and Iran in the 1970s is pretty good. And I also think that when Chairman Mao died, the Turkey government sent, I don't think it was like a military attaché or some generals to Beijing to pay the tribute to the funeral, and it was like a Chinese government also in this kind of like publicity campaigns to show that all the people are mourning the death of the great leader. I think it was actually in a pretty high positions to all the countries that is trying to pay the respects to Chairman Mao, and that includes the Turkey delegations.
Okay, thank you for your answer. It was very interesting.
So I would like to touch upon a few aspects. First of all, along the lines, as you mentioned in your article, of Kenneth Waltz and David Singer, the three-level analysis of foreign policy, which is the individual, the domestic level of states, and then the international system. Somehow, your article, the article on Journal of Cold War, is interesting. I mean, his originality lays mostly on the first two elements, in the sense that you try to analyze and provide more highlights on China's approach towards the Arab-Israeli conflict by looking at the role of ambassador personalities, Zhou Enlai, and then, of course, also contextualizing Chinese foreign policy in the turbulent evolution of Mao's radicalization in those years. Now, first focus on the personalities. Okay, very interesting. Like of course, to the role of these, I would say, trailblazers of Chinese diplomacy. People like Xu Ying, Chen Jiakang, and Wang Hua. I have a question about this. It's actually quite relevant, the role of Egypt. I mean, you have like two very important personalities like Wang Hua, Chai Zemin, that actually played a major role in China's Gaifeng, in Chinese reform and opening. Why do you think Egypt became like a sort of such a relevant post among many others, but Egypt seems having like a peculiar, significance in the career of these diplomats, especially considering the fact that Wang Hua, during the Cultural Revolution, was the only one who managed to resist to be called back to China.
Okay.
Can you explain us, please?
Okay, so thank you for the question. I think this is a very important question. So the first one, that in that article, that I try to argue that the personalities of this kind of like the people that actually carry out the policy will actually matters. Okay, so different kind of like their behavior will have the impact, especially when you don't have a very very kind of like a very large network of interactions. When you don't have this kind of like a very large civilians or business networks, and the major connection is about on the political terms, that this kind of like persons will play a very important role, either to upgrade or downgrade the relations. So I think their ideas, their understanding of the local information, their reports they're sent back to Beijing will make a difference to the understanding of the developments. Okay, so this is something that I try to emphasize on the article. And also about your question regarding the Egyptian role in the in China's Middle East policy, I think this has been my reason. Actually, my recent thinking also has relevance to this question or observation, is that I think China's focus in the Arab world has been shifted, like from the Arab Mediterranean to the Gulf. Okay, so in the beginning of the 1950s, I think all this kind of like focus has been on the Arab Gulf, Arab Mediterraneans. Okay, so first we have the Egyptian. The Egypt became the first country to establish diplomatic relations, and then China used Cairo as the hub, as all these kind of activities across the Middle East and in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think this is a very important contributing factors for China's focus on the Egyptian side. And also, I think hear me? You can hear me? Okay. Okay, because I'm stuck in my side, on my side. Okay, so I think because Egyptians has all kinds of like connections, both with the Palestinians, with the Algerians. So I think China will use this kind of like the channels to best to materialize its support for the PLO and for the FLN. Right, so this is something that I think this is why the importance of the Egyptian the Egypt back then. However, I think the focus of the Chinese focus on the Arab Mediterranean are primarily on the political aspects, on political levels. So with the reform and opening up, when China shifted its focus from the political issues to economic cooperations, the Gulf became the new destinations of the focus. So gradually, I think China moves away its attentions gradually from the Arab Mediterranean to the Arab Gulf. And as we can see for now, that especially after the Arab Spring, the Gulf countries became the de facto leaders of the Arab League. So we can see the President Xi Jinping have all these kind of like summits, all in Riyadh, and no matter like previously, we'll be in Cairo for the Arab League to host these events.
Okay, so since you touched upon this element, I would like to ask you, just leaving for 1 second, like the Cold War and touching upon more recent development. Of course, we are talking about the Chinese brokered agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. My question is, in which way you think that this agreement may impact the Abraham Accords and Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
Okay, so I think first of all, I would like to mention that the ISPI, the think tank in Italy, they just invite me to be one of the speakers for one of their events. I think next Tuesday, to talk about this event. So I think I could also like discuss it for now from my understandings. So I think that this is this deal that brokered by China, or not just by China, but also by other countries, but it was finalized in China. This deal, I think it was a very important way to at least as an attempt to forestall the escalation of the tensions between Israel and Iran. So I think, to me, I think in recent months or in recent years, especially in recent months, the clock of attacking Iran has been ticking in Israel, and then the only thing that both the government and the governing coalition and then the opposition in Israel that they can agree on is to attack Iran. Okay, is to attack Iran in one way or another. Okay, but with this kind of like deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I think the Israelis need to think twice what they should do, or whether they should kind of like to use attacking Iran as a convenience to divert the domestic crisis. Okay, so I think this is a very important. To me, I think it was actually beneficial for all the players, all the actors in the region. Okay, and I think the most important thing that, as you mentioned about the Abraham Accords, I think that let's don't forget that the Saudis is, largely speaking, it was more or less like China. The fundamental diplomatic or the foreign thinking in Riyadh, just like in Beijing, is balancing. So I think the Saudis is going to trying to like to talk with the Chinese that maybe we could negotiate a deal with the Iranians, and at the same time continue to negotiate with the U.S. state. We will also reach a deal, either in secret or in public, with the Israelis. I think this will maximize the interest of the Saudis. Okay, so this is something that I think it was have this like a connection that was actually to have this kind of like synergy with the Abraham Accords and in this regard.
Okay, so let's go back 1 second to the history. I'll ask you last couple of questions because you must be tired, and then we close it there.
Okay.
First question is about Eisenberg, and you mentioned the role of Eisenberg in like at the end of the 1970s in a situation where China and Israel on paper they didn't recognize each other, but Eisenberg managed through his network, to provide military technology to the PLA. But that was like a crucial moment because of the Chinese punitive expedition towards Vietnam on February 1979, which was, according to many observers, at least on the ground, it was not like exactly a successful military operation because China suffered many losses. My question is, and that actually that experience in Vietnam was a sort of powerful incentive for the acceleration of the modernization of the Chinese army, carried on then by Deng Xiaoping. So my question is, to what extent you think that the Israeli military technology contributed to the, modernization of the PLA at that stage?
Okay, so I think this is a very important question, and without the fully declassification of the relevant materials, I think nobody can answer with full confidence that to what extent that
someone can.
Oh yes, yes, but not in
not us.
Yeah, not in our positions. Okay, I'm pretty sure there's someone in the military commissions that can answer this question. Okay, so to me, I think that when we talk about the connection between the 1979 the border conflicts, the war between China and Vietnam, and the relations about China's modernization efforts, I think we also need to think about, we also need to remember that China start this kind of like efforts like before the 1979 war. I think it was like in the 1970s, I think China started to sending this kind of like delegations to Europe, trying to procure to purchase the military technology from the European countries, and it faced many obstacles. I think this is the main reason that China or the Israeli have these opportunities to sell itself to the sell these products or the modernization plans solutions to the Chinese. I think the first potential business is with the Europeans, especially the French and the British. I think, but there are two main problems. One is that the price is unacceptable to the PLA at the moment, and the second one is the NATO system. The might be compassionate with the Soviet system, but Israel has this kind of like advantage to using a relatively low price to modernize Soviet weapons, because it has captured and modernized so many weapons from the upper side, that the Soviet weapons from the upper side. So it provides a very unparalleled advantage for the Chinese to have this interactions with the Israelis. And I believe that China will actually use such kind of like a technology to go through a very difficult time for its military, especially when you're trying to cut the military budget for the economic development, but you still want to have this kind of like military capabilities to at least to delay or deter the USSR's military actions. So I think it plays a certain role in it.
Okay, thank you so much, Angela. My last questions, which is like basically the conclusion of our very interesting and stimulating conversation. First, a consideration. You correctly mentioned that actually China policy in the Middle East, it was more say framed and inspired by the competition with the Soviet Union over the Third World War. Over the Third World, which is something that, if I'm not wrong, was also highlighted by I don't remember his name, but Friedman. Was Jeremy Friedman, right?
Yeah,
Jeremy Friedman.
Yes, Jeremy Friedman.
And I think it's actually, I mean, to my understanding, of course, I mean, from a different perspective, but I tend to agree with that. There is actually something interesting in this, and this China's capacity, considering the limited material power that China had at the time vis-a-vis the superpower, and in this case, the Soviet Union, as you can see, for example, in the case of Egypt, you know, how the Soviet Union tried to, you know, UAR at the time, United Arab Republic, the Soviet Union was trying to chip in order to compete materially with China, you know, and also to persuade the Nasser about like the functional relationship with and Sadat as well. I think, if I'm not wrong, you know, that it was more feasible to cooperate and more convenient to cooperate with the Soviet Union. The same can be said for the PLO, you know, and with Arafat. The Soviet Union trying to challenge Chinese influence, you know, by, you know, chipping in, you know, and beating China materially, simply because, you know, Soviet Union was more, you say, powerful in material terms, more capable, you know, to provide, you know, material incentives, you know, to these regional actors, and China could not. But there is an element that to me is quite striking in terms of strategy. that Chinese capacity, power is about maximization of your the capacity to maximize the impact of your, material resources. If you have, strategy. So if you are capable to correctly, capitalize the few material resources that you have in order to achieve, great results, this is a very good strategy. And China, to a certain extent, managed, to attract the Soviet Union in a competition was asymmetric. You used asymmetric for, the more recent time when it comes to China and the United States, but at that time, the Soviet Union and China were very much asymmetric actor in their capacity to compete in the region. Nonetheless, the Soviet Union was chasing China, trying to, and it was attracted by China in this competition in the region. This is an interesting element because there is another Cold War historian, Ben Schaeffer, he worked with me on Sino-Soviet competition, and in particular in Germany during the Cold War, and he said that actually China played a role in the dilution of the détente. You know that in 1970s, there was a process of dialogue, between the superpower, the so-called détente, that was based on the, control or limitation of strategic weapons, nuclear power of both superpower. And but basically, China was very much against, the process of détente and the dialogue, especially over the status quo. That's the key process on European soil. Remember, Mao was very critical and worried that the Soviet Union could appease the West over European soil in order to then focus towards China in the East. So the interesting. Schaeffer says actually that what Chinese, China played a role in the Middle East, but in particular in the Horn of Africa, and the role that China played in those years was functional, to attract the Soviet Union, and somehow elevate, improve Soviet Union commitment in the competition with the United States in the Third World in such a way that then eventually became detrimental to the continuation of the détente. In fact, Brzezinski, one of the reasons that with the Carter administration, pushed, the Carter administration to choose the Brzezinski line of new, Cold War, a new containment of the Soviet Union vis-a-vis, the more pro-détente line of Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State, was the fact that that the Soviet Union was becoming too aggressive in the Third World, and especially in the Horn of Africa. So I think that the role of China is actually quite interesting. The way how they manage also to play a very important role in superpower and therefore in the evolution of national system at that stage. Now, looking at this parallel, so China as an actor that with low material capacity is capable somehow to influence the evolution of superpower relations, in that case, détente, and therefore containment. Now we can move to today's framework, and we look at China and the US in the region. Paradoxically, China now is playing the opposite role. China now is playing the role of a peace, is actually bringing public goods in the region, and instead of playing the role of to deactivate process of détente, so of appeasement between great powers, is actually playing the opposite role. So now I'm asking you, after this obviously successful achievement in China's capacity to broker, the Saudi and the Iranian is a new normalization, let's call it this way. We don't know how resilient that will be. We will see. But do you think that China is going to also place card in order to achieve a similar agreement between Israel and Palestine?
Okay. So that's I think this so for a short answer for the question is I don't have a very positive view about the possibility about reaching an agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians, at least in the foreseeable future. I think the most important conditions for the Saudis and Iranians is that after so many years of the fighting and the proxy wars and this kind of things, the both sides has been exhausted in one way or another, and now they are facing much more urgent danger or crisis, and they try to seek stabilities in current settings. Okay, so so this is the thing that I would like to apply to the possible Chinese role in mediating between the Israelis and Palestinians, or between the Russians and the Ukrainians. I think that in this the latter two conflicts, or in the two latter tensions, I don't see the two sides has been. I don't see the two sides in these two conflicts has been wholly exhausted. Okay, and they have their own like this kind of like reasons to continue the fight. Okay, and either side will risk the danger of to seek compromise for now. So so personally speaking, I don't think that I think that China might play a more visible role in mediating these two conflicts, but I doubt whether you will achieve the same results as we can see at such a big news, or at least great achievements in paper as the Saudis and the Iranians does. Okay.
Thank you. I tend to agree with you, but history is life is more surreal than art, so we can be surprised. And actually, to use along the lines of Professor Liu Xinchun that mentioned, always stated that there is a much ampler space of compromise between the United States and China and the Middle East in terms of compatibility of interest in the region. Who knows? Let's hope for the best and see whether these turns of the event may generate also a sort of general appeasement, which is very much needed. So thank you so much, Professor She, and thank you so much, Gangzheng. And it's always great to chat with you and listen at your expertise. And thank you so much to all the students and auditors. And I see my students next week. And of course, this is an open platform, so whoever wants to join is welcome to do that. Thank you so much again.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah. Bye bye.